It becomes irresistible to stop at the villages which sprinkle the way. They look idyllic. I know they can't be.
Очень прекрасная кишлака.
Да. Живем здесь.
Да. Что вы сделаете здесь? Вы фермеры, крестьяне.
This is typical. The man who asks me to his house turns out not to be a farmer at all, but a part-time geologist at a little silver mine over the hill.
Да, козу держим и корову держим.
Вы выращиваете тоже овощи?
Нет. Овощи сделаем здесь, морковку и картошку.
Картошку тоже?
Да, для себя.
Ваш мальчик. Спасибо большое.
Садитесь.
Это ваша жена?
Да, мой жена. Что она пьет? Берите или пьешь?
But the rest of the time, he keeps goats and cows, grows poplar trees for roof beams. He lives with his wife and children, and he adds, a sister.
У меня три.
But in an Islamic country, where, all the same, polygamy is forbidden, the word sister sometimes conceals a secret second wife. But I cannot tell.
Вы живете долго здесь или нет?
20 лет здесь.
20 лет? Спасибо. I remember the travel writer Fair Stark, when once asked whether travel broadened the mind, just simply said no, by which of course she meant that if you travel with prejudices, they'll only be fulfilled by your experiences abroad. I think that traveling in some way distances you from your own culture. You may feel less integral to it after you've returned. You may look at it with slightly different eyes. You no longer feel, I suppose, as you perhaps did as a much younger person, that the natural way to be is to be English. A dreadful idea.
يرشبت بقسام لباسيا Yorginayni küydürüp ya
This is one of the special frissons of travel, when you reach somewhere that's teased you from the map for years. It's the Darya, the ancient Jaxartes, one of the two great landlocked rivers of Central Asia. Comes winding out of the Pamirs, finds its end in the Aral Sea, miles away.
Colin, I've been calling you for ages. Where the hell have you been? You've obviously forgot my birthday, been and gone. And this weekend we were due at Mummy's. You really are too bloody much.
Mountains Stockocand, thin membrane of grass over lower slopes, with naked rock pushing through. Shale-filled valleys, dust of early snow. Apricot, maple, silver poplar, bedded together in long strips of yellow, green and crimson, which unfurl along the river like a Chinese scroll. Sends up memories. Lame donkey, child on quilt, house being built, house decaying, old woman eating liposhki under vine, clatter of water, silence. I've grown used to making notes under almost any conditions. Unless I write them down,
I forget in particular the little details which give life to a description, the texture of a wall perhaps, or the precise way somebody spoke. These notes become the heart of the book which will be written back at home. As they accumulate, I become terrified of losing them.
Kim kelir? Ama akasizmi? Jinnimisiz?
This is the top hotel in Kokand. Luckily, I'm just amused by this sort of plumbing, and don't see why the cockroaches shouldn't share it as well. Kokand has a long reputation for being run down. In the last century, it was ruled by a succession of bloodthirsty tyrants who used their palace virtually as an arsenal for the manufacture of gunpowder and rifles. Criminals here were routinely impaled or buried alive until the Russians arrived in 1876. Then the last Khan fled to Mecca after distributing his harem among his friends. As recently as 1905, a visiting Western doctor described Kokand as virtually a city of cretins.
In my case, I think fear disappears with experience, with understanding. I've always felt that the closer you come to a people, the deeper your experience of them, the less you start to fear them. And I think maybe that is not always exactly true, but usually with me, it's happened that a people that's unknown to me have been unnerving. In many travel writers, there is a sense of some kind of psychic restlessness. I don't travel to escape, I'm happy in England, but abroad I feel my sensibilities are heightened, my ingenuity is taxed, my values are tested, and I simply delight in what is so different.
Ne oldu? Paşanı çağırıyor mu?
Unaqangi o'tamiz.
Ha, qanaqa o't o'zi? Paşanni nima o'zi?
Melisa. Bildingizmi, dadasi Melisa. To'ppa tuzukkina uyda o'tirdim. Siz aytdingiz, "Hoy xotin, ani jahon bozoriga chiqqin, narsalarni sotgin. Axir bola-chaqani uylashimiz kerak, mashina olib bergin" deb siz qo'ymadingiz.
Ya? Ha, nima oldu o'zi?
Bitta yaponskiy ro'mol ushlab tursam, bir yigit kelib shapti bilagimdan ushlasa bo'ladimi?
Seni bilagingdan ushladimi? Qanaqa yigit ekan o'zi, hayotiga to'shka qo'yib qo'yaman hozir.
Kokand turns out to be the center of an old verbal sport of the Uzbeks, askhiya. It's a kind of ritual insulting competition, like the Greek cataclysmos. People are assembling to enjoy an exchange of insults. Part ritualized, I think, part extempore. A contest of wits in which the Uzbek words are filled with double meanings and innuendo, personal and sexual. These two seem to be engaged in the classic war between the sexes. I can't understand a word, but somehow it doesn't seem to matter.
Bu arqa tomon sizga.
Oldi sizga, orqasi bizgami? Yo'linlari yog'i sizga, hammasi menga.
Bo'lmasa mana bizni vodiy bir ajoyib vodiyki, parandalar ham yaxshi ko'radi. Parandalarning nomidan kulishamizmi?
Mayli Jo'raxon aka.
Bo'ldi, ketdi. Men sizni muhabbatxon desam, mani bog'imda bulbulni o'rniga sayrab turgan olaqanot ekansiz.
Men sizni Jo'raxon aka desam, cho'ntagida hemrisi yo'q boyo'g'li ekansiz.
Boyo'g'li. Boyo'g'li bormi, boyo'g'li? Men sizni muhabbatxon desam, qaddi bastingizga qarab turib o'zginamni po'nqishim ekansiz.
Men sizni Jo'raxonaga desam, kechqurunlari uylanib o'ylaydigan inguk ekansiz.
Someone nearby tells me they were joking lewdly. You've got the bottom, the man says. You mean we'll do it frontward, she answers, and you'll take the backside too? Then, like disillusioned lovers, they compare each other to crows, bats and old goats.
Ben sizni muhabbatxon desam, bo'g'oz ekansiz.
Men sizni Jo'raxonaga bir sassiq qush desam, sassiq popshak ekansiz.
Ben sizni muhabbatxon desam, mushukchadan ham uval ekansiz.
Men sizni Jo'raxonaga xo'roz qush desam, makiyon ekansiz.
A travel book for me is a search for people's heart. It's a kind of passion. The heart's, I suppose, is a rather unidentifiable object, but I think even with individuals we feel that there's something that makes them tick. Here's a whole unacknowledged nation, really. Some 30 million or more of these Turkic, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, a whole secret people, if you like, who are landlocked, who haven't been united since the death of Tamerlane 600 years ago. And I ask myself, who are they? What's their future?
Есть
много поездов в Самарканд.
Самарканд один поезд, в Ташкенте.
Только один день.
Нет, день один.
Вы живете здесь? If I travel with friends, I seem to be looking out from a little capsule of Englishness, saying, isn't that odd? Isn't that funny? But if you're alone, you're the funny one. Travel both increases your love of life and increases your acceptance of your own sort of mortality or your own place in things. You fit into a context better. If you are subjected to a very narrow environment, say as one might be in central London, you begin to feel that the world revolves around maybe you yourself, let alone central London. Out here, or anywhere, particularly in the great countries of Asia, you realize that even Europe is only a small part of the world, and that the vast majority of the world's people are moving in a completely different rhythm, and they've scarcely heard even of the country from which you come.
چقدر سخت خدایا 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 چقدر سخت خدایا.
The more beset you are by petty complaints and considerations, the more you are living statically and narrowly, the more you allow the sort of trivia of ordinary life to crawl all over you, then the less joy you have in the world, inevitably. And curiously enough, the more important you yourself seem. It's out here, with another sort of enjoyment, that I feel more expanded. And one ceases to be like the sort of spider in the center of one's own web.
تو براش گفته نتونی
you feel often touched and moved, I think, that the same sources of sorrow are relative to you and them, that you touch on somebody's delight in something quite simple which also delights you. And so with me often there's this tension going on all the time. You're probably, at least psychologically, wanting to touch on the things which you share, but you're endlessly stimulated by the things that you don't share. And you're teased intellectually as well. You look out, particularly in many Asian countries, thinking, why are they behaving like that? What is it precisely that makes them do that? Often quite some small habit, something little that seems to, or should, tell you a great deal about the whole society, if only you could understand it. Train to Leninabad, a whole village on the move. White cubicles of isolated life, filled with the excitement, pathos of going away, of going somewhere else. Russians are turning home, Uzbeks to Tashkent, playing cards, drinking tea. Women, dark, exclamatory, vivid, bemused old men. Faces in sleep, flaccid, vulnerable. Children in mother's arms. Sense of fleeting freedom, women especially. Pleasure, anxiety, release.
This pass, known as the Gates of Tamerlane, was once the avenue for Mongol and Turkic invaders, descending on the valley of Samarkand to the south. Traveling like this, beside an Uzbek rider, I feel a bit like an invader myself. The Mongol Emperor Tamerlane pushed through here after 5 days of battle.
In 1405, at the age of 70, he was already marching on China when he died of a lung infection and was brought back to be buried here. I find myself wondering how I can ever convey to a reader who may never even have heard of Tamerlane quite the sense of awe and even slight trepidation that I feel before entering the death chamber of this brilliant monster. I'm used to thinking of cruelty and artistic refinement as being only uneasily compatible in one person, but this man embellished Samarkand with works created by the craftsmen he brought back from his campaigns in India and Persia, and himself invented a new form of chess. And yet he devastated whole cities and literally built hillocks of skulls around the lands he'd conquered. Tamerlane lay surrounded by his descendants under a cube of black jade, while the dome propelled a soft blaze of light onto everything below. Yet in the tomb's heart, I felt, there remained something dignified and rather terrible, the recognition of the littleness even of this man, and the passage of time. For weeks after his death, Tamerlane was said to have howled from his tomb. It lies beneath this cenotaph in a crypt which is scarcely ever seen. This is the real grave of Tamerlane, carved with his genealogy. which traces a common ancestor to Genghis Khan. It is said that Tamerlane laid a curse on anybody who should disturb his grave, promising that disaster would follow. His grave was disturbed by Soviet archaeologists in 1941. A few hours later, news arrived that the Germans had attacked Russia. In a country which exudes official propaganda about itself, a relic of Marxism, I become anxious that I'm being deceived, that I'm not seeing right. It's an old travel writer's anxiety, a sense of being excluded. So I'm always trying, as it were, to read the signs in a place, whether in Kokand or Tashkent. And here, the signs are often muddled. The new, the ancient, and officially discarded communism, a stirring Islam. This is a country in which the old hardline communist hierarchy is in fact still in place, and is mafia-ridden. The statues of Marx appear less to be supervising proletarian masses than gazing over Mongol steppes. For lust of knowing what should not be known, we take the golden road to Samarkand. But nothing is quite as you expected, or as the poet Flecker could have guessed. The road to Samarkand is a 2-lane highway.
دیگر به خدا نام وطن خانه نشینم یا ایران منو ای هموطنان گرد همایین که امروز بخش هر کس عکس زمان خوش به زین است یا
I came upon an avenue of tombs named Shahi Zindan, the living king, after the saint buried in its heart. All through the 14th century, the faithful were interred here in mausolea of elaborate beauty. I found myself walking quietly, as if I might waken something. This was a place of private piety and grief. It softened death with a discreet beauty. But the geometric bandings of tomb and shrine and the swirl of Quranic script, itself a kind of musical geometry, could not quite dispel, even now, a sense of ending and of sorrow. он зовут Святой, зовут Шахзиндан.
Его
значит?
Шахзинда, его псевдоним. Вот местный народ его Шахзинда. Когда ему отрубили голову, он ушел живым. Это на персидском языке Шахзинда. А его зовут Кусам ибн Аббас.
The saint buried here, he told me, was a cousin of Muhammad. He was the first believer here, and his head was cut off by fire worshippers as he read the scriptures. But he gathered it up again and ascended a well into paradise, where he waits to return. Now, pilgrims come from all over Central Asia, the sick, the childless, and his spirit heals them. This man what he'd witnessed here. He went on to say that he himself had been cured of kidney disease simply by cleaning around the tomb of the saint. When will the saint return? I asked. At the end of the light, the man replied, on the last day. If we live, we'll see it. I must be just approaching the Zarafshan River now, which is the river that feeds this rich little valley of Samarkand and Bukhara. It rises in a glacier just to the east and fades out about 60 miles from the Oxus River. But now it's become one vast cotton field as far as I can see. Cotton's been the disaster of all this area. It's tied to the Soviet centralized economy and leached away the soil, so both the two great rivers of this land, the ancient Jaksatis and Oxus, have just about been halved in extent, and the Aral Sea into which they flow is almost dwindled away in parts. Even the cotton that's produced is in fact not of much use. It seems to be such a poor quality that the demand for it on the international market's gone, and the artificial fertilizers and defoliants that have been used have been ruinous to the health, especially of the children that work there. Anemia, cancer, and hepatitis. Still, it's good just here.
Get up, let's cheer up, the sun is red. Love, glad, be happy, what if I blue? Now I'm walking through fields of flowers. Rain may drip, but still I live for hours and hours.
Bu dünyanı işlere her yolda dur, her yolda sahab işle hamamız kıla durmaz, kılamız sahab işle hamamız kıla durmaz, kılamız lek sahab likiteyor.
I can understand how a journey may be seen as a metaphor for life, a voyage through time as well as space, time seen as a road. I used to think that the novels I wrote were quite different from my travel books, that the travel books dealt with the outer world and the novels more with the inner landscape and my own feelings. But I think, in fact, that they're both haunted by a tension between the actual and the ideal, between what people dream about and what's really possible to them.
an obsession with the horizon, I suppose, whether it's geographical or emotional. The sheer thirst for experience must be at the root of my travel instinct. As a young man, I couldn't conceive that I wouldn't by now have seen every beautiful and strange building and landscape on Earth, every different society. In the end, in my journeys, I think experience itself is the lure, which is fundamentally romantic, I suppose. I suspect artists have never quite grown up. As a young man, I ached for every kind of experience. I was distressed that I didn't fall committedly in love, not enough to marry. But later I fell in love like that. Certainly, there are things in my life which anyone might guess produce this restlessness. The death of my sister when I was 19, the end of a happy childhood. My falling deeply but one-sidedly in love with a woman more independent even than me. But I remember myself as always like this, even as a child, independent and dreamy. And still, at the age of 52, I go on feeling as if I'm on the brink of something, as if anything's possible, just round the bend in the road. I suppose that's called still being young. And I suppose that's how I'll end, still feeling that life's just started. I've always been haunted by the words of Isaac Newton, who discovered so much, and who said in old age that all his life he'd been like a boy playing on the seashore, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before him. I understand that. But the point, at least for other people, is what you discover along the way, what your restlessness produces. It's strange. It's almost as if I regard myself as two of me going. There's the one who's experiencing, the one who's traveling, the one who perhaps is suffering a bit, and there's the one who's, as it were, sitting on his shoulder, watching and saying, we're going to write about this. And even while the one who's experiencing is perhaps being interrogated by the police or suffering from heat stroke or getting food poisoned in a chaikhana, the one who's sitting on his shoulder is saying, this is good material. We can write about this. This is part of the personality of the country. This is a bit of reality. And I think what I fear as a travel writer is not that anything dreadful will happen to me, let alone anything good, but that nothing will happen at all. I'd hoped to reach Bukhara by nightfall, but it's long after that. 1,000 years ago, Bukhara was the capital of a huge empire spread through Central Asia. A lodestar for the whole Islamic world, a city of the arts, sciences. By the 19th century, it had fallen into a disastrous decline. Become one of the most inaccessible and fanatical cities of Asia, ruled by a dynasty of cruel and decadent emirs who kept harems of hundreds of women and even boys. The center of the slave trade. For centuries, virtually no Westerner ever came here, and those who did so often came in disguise and always at peril of their lives. In 1843, in a celebrated incident, two British officers named Stoddart and Connolly arrived to give the Emir help against Russia. But the Emir took offense against them quixotically and threw them into a prison which he had stocked with rats and scorpions and sheep ticks. They languished there for months. Then after a British disastrous reverse in Afghanistan, they were hauled out and publicly executed.
In the vermin-infested pit where they were originally incarcerated, the British officers Stoddart and Connolly have been reduced to models of cloth and clay, themselves disintegrating. Just museum pieces.
Mr. Thubron, Bemvers the builders here. Your cleaner called, and we've been round to fix up the roof. 3 missing slates, nothing much. You shouldn't have any more trouble with it.
Perhaps the most delightful moments of travelling are when you, as it were, stretch out a hand over the geographical and political divides and find that your grief or your pleasure is held in common with somebody who in every other way appears to be quite different from yourself. No, сейчас. Будут лучше, может быть.
I ask him if things will get better in Uzbekistan, but he says he knows things that I don't. I'm just a simple man, he says, but I know my way about.
Да.
Я больше тебе знаю. Я знаю все, как ты переговорил, как там, джики, потом все там займай, джики. Мы мужики, я остальное не знаю. Я не граф, не лорд, я простой рабочий. Я работаю, я человек, я сам для себя.
The Russians grabbed us and didn't have a thing to give us. Poor Russian Ivan. Not a ruble, not a shit. Our earliest leader was just a pederast who sold us to Lenin. And the Russians have still got us. Big Brother is still Big Brother. The ordinary man will always be cheated. And, he went on, we'll have the same lying bastards at the top, lining their pockets. Just give us back the earth. There's enough to feed and clothe us all. God gave the earth to everyone. Was Islam rising again here in its impassioned certainties, I wondered, or flickering to an end? It was not in the formal centres of worship that it seemed most fervently at work. Rather, it was in these ancient places of folk memory, the tombs of saints. I sensed the closeness of an old pride suppressed for 60 years. As I watched these pilgrims, I felt as if I were eavesdropping on a religion which I could not share, like nostalgia for some lost faith of my own.
lies the legendary Oxus River, and beyond that, a land I've always wanted to explore.
وقتی عاشق شبی رازی دل تو گفته نتونی وقتی عاشق شبی رازی دل تو گفته نتونی چقدر سخت خدایا 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 روز نوروز بچینی گل سرخ بر سر راه نگاه خرش کنی روز نوروز بچینی گل سرخ بر سر راه نگاه خرش کنی دلبرت بیاد بپرسی کار کیست تو براش گفته نتونی چقدر سخت خدایا چقدر سخت خدایا